United opposition is an absolute necessity for a strong democracy. Good evening and welcome to Face to Face. For the Newsfirst team, I'm Niresha. With me this evening is no stranger to our viewers, Mr. Kusum Wijetilleke, Working Committee member of the SJB, the main opposition party. Good evening and welcome, Kusum.
Good evening, Niresha. Happy New Year to you and Happy New Year to your audience. Thank you very much for having me.
To you. Right, Kusum, we have an election coming up, the third one in just a few months. So we're expecting it perhaps in April, perhaps in May. No proper date yet, but it will happen. And obviously, most people are expecting the NPP to win it quite handily, as the NPP won the last election and the one before that. Now, where is the opposition in all this? And when I say the opposition, I mean all of the opposition parties. Where's the SJB, where's the UNP, the NPP, and of course the so-called minority parties? What's going on with them? What's the news coming out of there?
Well, Niresh, I think it's a fair question, right? Elections coming up. The SJB, as you know, we have to reorganize, reassess, and that's happening right now in the background. I think there will be some announcements made soon. It's obviously a little bit above my pay grade. I think there's one thing we have to make clear to the audience is that the composition of parliament is the result of the elections, right? It is the people that have created a relatively weak opposition in 40 members for the SJB. So I think the most important thing is that when you're weak in numbers, that you have to be united. So I think the SJB needs to get a little more united than they are right now. And I think it will happen as you know, in the aftermath of a defeat, there are a lot of voices that come out. There's a lot of critique. And I think the leadership has to take on board all the criticism from various parts and formalize and strategize a way in which we can present a united opposition for the benefit of the people of the country. That's essentially what it is. At the upcoming election, the NPP has its own issues. We are now looking at a party that's no longer an insurgent party. It's the party of power. So they now have a record. It's a very short record. And any criticism that we level at the government will do so with the caveat that it's a very new government. They're just getting their feet under the table.
Absolutely.
And I think we have to give them a certain amount of time. But having said that, the signs, I think, are a little bit concerning. And I think we'll get into that a little bit later. But in this election, the opposition and the SJB and the other opposition parties will surely make the case that what we've seen from the government thus far has been far below what was expected. It doesn't meet their own rhetoric and their own manifesto. And I wonder what the public will think about this moderation of the NPP.
Well, we'll get to the NPP in a short while, but I'd like to focus first on the opposition parties. Now, Kusum, of course, when it came to the last two elections, many people were saying that if the UNP and SJB had only managed to broker some kind of alliance, that they would have mounted a much stronger challenge to the NPP. But of course that never happened. It never came close to happening. Are we seeing the same situation going into the third election, which is the local government?
So Niresh, when I talked about the unity of the opposition, right, the opposition also includes people like Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, right? He's a power center in and of itself. And what we see is that he is also pulling in his own direction. So there is a problem where you have a few power centers in the opposition, even a very weak power center, a couple of nationalist seats. I'm not even sure who has filled those seats currently at the moment. But it's very difficult when there is, the whole idea is that you're supposed to work together for the betterment of the country. But even in the post-election period, now we've had two elections. I know we have one coming up, but at least now there should be this period where you can get together, formulate plans together. Instead, what we see is There is in the media, regular jibes at each other from opposite sides of the spectrum. There seems to be some confusion about bringing together these disparate parts of the center-right from Sri Lankan politics. This is, to me, it's fascinating because the center-right has been proven to be extremely unpopular, not just in Sri Lanka, especially in Sri Lanka, but around the world. And we've seen already the NPP themselves from a center-left have moderated themselves to the center. So there's a lot of space left on this center-left axis, but no one seems to be willing to take on that mantle. So that's one side of it. On the other side of it, I think this election, the previous election, should also have been about austerity. And we're going through a period of austerity in this country. What is the government's plan to do something about it? These are the main themes that we have going forward. So, I take your point that there needs to be a much more vocal opposition, but I think it's fair to say there is a lull in the period immediately after the elections. And as we say, the government is getting its feet under the table. So let's see how they go along.
Right. So Kusum, now is there even any talk of a discussion going on, perhaps behind the scenes between the SJB and the UNP? There's nothing wrong with talking. It takes a lot of negotiation to create any kind of alliance. But is there anything happening at all, or are the two parties so vehemently opposed to each other based on personality clashes more than anything else, that there's absolutely nothing going on?
Yeah, Niresh, I don't want to comment too much on speculation. I think I heard the General Secretary of the party make a comment on this as well, that there haven't been any serious discussions yet, but he indicated that there could be in the future. I think from a personal point of view, as a member of the SDB Working Committee, all I can say is that I don't see where the benefit comes, right? The SJB's reason for existence, our raison d'etre, is the failure of the UNP. The failure of the UNP is intimately tied to Mr. Wickremesinghe's governance and administration of that party. The UNP is in this situation where it only contested in Nuwara. It's in this situation because of that leadership. Now, whatever cachet of support Mr. Wickremesinghe, still has, I'm afraid it also brings a negative connotation, right? I saw someone write in the papers that he has something of a reverse Midas touch, where everything he touches sort of gets corrupted and crumbles and gets, corroded. He has a corrosive nature to him.
That's an interesting way to describe it.
Well, it's not my analogy. Unfortunately, someone else's. I can't remember quite who. So this is the problem. He has such a corrosive nature, and as I mentioned him specifically because he casts a shadow across politics, because he has a certain amount of elite consensus behind him, right? And even the NPP has fallen into his trap. So now his supporters will say, well, the NPP is doing so well, they're following the Ranil Wickremesinghe program, and that's why the country will come out of this. But when the country eventually crashes because of this very program and its debt restructuring agreement, those very same supporters will say that it was the NPP's fault for not managing the economy. So I think this government has to be very careful how it manages the legacy of Mr. Wickremesinghe's short stint, because the whole problem, and why people like us on this channel, why we were complaining so much during his tenure, was that he had no mandate, but still had the power to have very deep and long-lasting impacts on our economy and our social structures and our institutions. And that has to be reversed immediately from day one. And this government has sort of forgotten that part of their mandate. There was a lot of damage done to our institutions from the Rajapaksa period. And remember, Mr. Wickremesinghe's period was also part of the Rajapaksa period. And that institutional damage is still there, and we have to counteract this. I saw on one of your shows on Face the Nation, an economist, Danusha Gihan Patrina, talk about all the tax incentives and tax breaks that have been given in an ad hoc manner to large corporations, international companies, local companies. The total cost was something like 1 trillion rupees. That's about the size of this state sector wages. So what is the government's plan going forward on state sector wages, as well as uncovering where this money went. Massive tax breaks were given out to corporations. What did they generate in return? You don't give tax breaks to a company for nothing. You give it to them based on certain benchmarks, based on certain promises of delivery. What has happened? So these are the questions that we want answers from. The VFS scandal, it happened just a few months, into the previous
So
years.
is it your contention that the present government is not acting firmly enough to look into these areas and to revamp taxation and to get away from the Ranil Wickremesinghe model?
Yes, I mean, I would like for them to address their own criticisms of the previous government now that they are in power. They are the ones who made the criticism that this program is not going to lead to debt sustainability. They were the ones who were saying that we have to somehow increase our tax revenue, that we have to take the burden off the people, that we have to fix our governance systems, that we have to reform the customs department. So here we are. Now, again, I add the caveat for our audience to be completely fair to the new government. It's a new government. They need to be given time. But now even the conversations around these things have sort of disappeared. Now the conversation is back to being about vehicle imports, withholding tax rates, the tax-free threshold. I mean, some of these are important and they play a vital part in our IMF program and our revenues. But this is not the transformational new policy direction that was promised. Now, it's not my promise I'm asking the government to deliver. The government should start delivering on their own promises, and I don't think that's an unfair request.
So you seem to be inferring that the left of center NPP has now shifted its stance ideologically.
Well, Niresh, you can't come into power because they can't pretend that they don't have a conception of a problem, right? They are the ones who gave us the conception of the problem. Many of their own members refer to the IMF as a neo-colonial institution. They said they're an institution of control. They said that they are a way of enforcing a neoliberal policy structure on a country. They said that it contracts our economy, that it's going to make it more difficult for our country to grow, which means when our country has less growth, it's more difficult to generate tax revenue, right? Because taxes come from income. So the simple point is, how are they going to reduce the burden on the people, increase growth by following the same austerity program of the Ranil Wickremesinghe government? And I just want to make it clear to your audience, what we are doing right now, this program of austerity is not something that's enforced by the IMF. The IMF gave us a target for a primary account surplus. How you achieve that is completely up to the government. But the government's program makes it clear. They negotiated a 15% revenue to GDP target from the IMF. 15% is the absolute lowest that a country of our size and with our structure should be able to have. We should be aiming for 18, 19, 20% tax to GDP. But for that to happen, you have to take some really difficult decisions. Corporate tax to GDP, personal income tax to GDP. We have record lows in these ratios. We have to start raising them. Now, I have to say, maybe there is some contradiction because we know the NPP also had a lot of corporate support, funding, lobbying. You can see that with the vehicle imports. They have capitulated to the interests of an upper middle class crust of Sri Lanka that wants these vehicle imports released. Fundamentally, Niresh, there is something wrong in our economy when you have to, when it's the norm to have 300% tax on a depreciating asset, but you have a lot of people willing to pay it. That's a problem. If you have an apartment in central Colombo that costs the same as a luxury vehicle, that's a problem. That means there's an imbalance in this economy. This government is just coming in and saying, oh, I think we can afford to manage this imbalance. The central bank governor himself said, I think we can afford to manage this imbalance. The IMF said, oh, we think, I think it was Mr. Brewer who said, we think that vehicle imports would be a good source of revenue for the government. So they know we can't reach these revenue milestones without vehicle imports. But then they also accept that there will be pressure on the rupee. Toyota alone has $250 million in a single consignment of orders, right? So no one can say there is no pressure on the rupee. So then what was the rush for this? This is what you call capitulation to elite consensus. This is what happens when you appoint roughly the same group of top economic advisors and corporate citizens to your committees that previous administrations also appointed.
So what you're saying is this is hardly the radical change in policy that was expected.
Yeah, it's a tinkering of the status quo. There's nothing more than that. It's a tinkering of the status quo. They've looked at the withholding tax and thought, oh, we can generate more tax revenue from here. Then we'll increase the threshold by 50,000, not 100,000, which is what they said. So, okay, that's fine. That's a progressive move. But did we need an NPP government, a centre-left government to come? If you waited a few more months, Ranil Wickremesinghe would have made these changes by himself. He anyway started at a certain point and then slowly made these incremental changes where people thought it's progressive because he started at such a low point. So I just think that the fundamental promise of the NPP government has just not been followed up. And I expect that they will make some changes to their budget that they will present, but the vote on account didn't suggest anything major, right? So this all comes down to not taking up their own position on the IMF program and trying to renegotiate it. That they want to play it safe. Okay.
Are you surprised at the stance that they took after coming into office?
I'm less surprised by the stance, Niresh. I'm surprised by the rhetoric. You know, when you have 160 seats in parliament, when you have a leader and a president who is extremely popular, but even people that didn't vote for him, they say he seems like a decent guy, seems like someone you can trust, seems like someone that has the country's best interests at heart. Where is his rhetoric? You know, I like Clean Sri Lanka. I think it's an important, necessary project. I think he's made some good noises on certain things, some of the previous corruption cases. But this is not the AKD that we saw on the campaign trail. This is not the insurgent candidate that was, you know, saying that we have to transform the structure of our economy, that we have divergent sections of the people who never interact with each other. That's why they talked about how everyday life for most Sri Lankans has become difficult, mundane, a struggle, and that we have to improve people's quality of life, not just their standard of living. So my question is how? Where are the plans? What are you going to do? Now you're here, you have a whole manifesto, you had a 200-page manifesto. I like some of that manifesto. Can we see it enforced? Can we see it implemented? It's a very basic fact. Sri Lanka has some of the lowest corporate tax to GDP amongst peer group countries. Okay, that's just a fact. That's my opinion. If you take our peer group, lower middle income countries, we have a corporate tax to GDP of about 2%, 1.5% in some years. So with all this, I think publicfinance.lk released the figures for 2023 based on a projection for the final 3 months. It was about 2%, right? So this is in a fiscal consolidation, in a revenue-based fiscal consolidation. We are unable to get our corporate tax to GDP about 2%. That's not acceptable, right? Because this is where the money is going. Dr. Shamini Kurre of the IMF said Sri Lanka has had decades of ad hoc tax incentives, tax giveaways. I invite anyone in our audience to go to the Colombo Stock Exchange website, go to any top corporate conglomerate, check their income statement, calculate their rate of tax that they're paying. It's in their cash flow statements and in their income statement. They're not paying anywhere near this 34, 36% that people think. They're not even paying 28%. So this is the problem, right? So income tax levels have improved, but they improve from such a low base. And what is the outcome of that? More VAT, more consumption taxes. So what does that mean? Higher cost of living. Higher cost of living means lower national savings rate. We have one of the lowest national savings rates amongst peer group countries. It's a moderate level, about 20%. Nowhere near enough for a country like us. So the problem, Niresh, that I have, and I'm sure you might have the same problem, we don't have accounts in Singapore or Seychelles or the Cayman Islands. Okay, so what we have is here in this country. It's too late for me to migrate. I don't know about yourself. So we need this to go right. We don't get many opportunities. If we reach 2028, 2029 and have another restructuring, we are done for. We're not going to have an economy.
Now, there seems to be quite a consensus on that point that this government needs to succeed, otherwise the country will simply fall. It will go into chaos, because we already had Gotabaya Rajapaksa's absolute mess that he caused, and then people were literally dropping dead in fuel queues after standing there for a week. That kind of dire situation, and then it's been brought to a situation where there is enough supply. But if things go wrong once again, and it's all in the hands of this government, then we might end up in just as bad a situation.
Yeah, another thing that surprised me, Niresh, was that I think there's something to be said about the benefit of continuity of officials, like the central bank governor, the treasury secretary, some of the members of the monetary board. I don't mind that argument. But I also think that if you're coming in with a fresh set of eyes or a new government, it should come in with a fresh set of eyes. And it should look at this from the top, bird's eye view, go into the nitty-gritties, do everything you need to do and get another opinion on this. It's like a doctor. You go to get a second opinion. Now, the problem with the debt restructuring deal, it's been brought up on this show, right? For one thing, we backdated the agreement. So we have to pay for interest from 2024 onwards. Then some of this interest is at a much higher rate than some of the other countries that have entered debt restructuring negotiations this year, in the last year. The debt restructuring agreement also includes this macro-linked bond. What that means is if our GDP goes above a certain level and as it grows, we have to pay more. And an international economist wrote for the Financial Times a few weeks ago that Sri Lanka and a few other countries that have entered into this macro-linked bond, the so-called MLBs, that the better their GDP does, the more their economy grows, the higher their likelihood or potential for debt distress, because their debt payments and interest payments go up, right? It's like if your country does better, if your GDP does a little better, the investors get a little extra bonus, a little windfall. Is that the point of this debt restructuring? If it is, then say so. But then don't tell me that the idea of the debt restructuring is for Sri Lanka's debt sustainability. No. Sri Lanka's debt sustainability then is a byproduct of protecting the returns and the interests of private investors. That's what's happening right now. So
now, Kusum, all that makes sense to you and to me and to economists and people like that, right? But to the voter, to the average voter, none of, all of that is far beyond them. They might, agree that yes, the IMF agreements should have been looked at a bit more closely, and why did the NPP government just continue with them? But that's not the clincher in their eyes. I mean, the reason that they will vote for the NPP again is simply, how are they doing? How do they have jobs? What's the cost of living like? And so on. So how does the opposition tap into this?
Well, I think the point is, Niresh, we have to understand where we are. Sri Lanka is undergoing a cost of living crisis. It is a crisis, and it's an urgent crisis. Right?
Absolutely.
And the longer we go on like this in this crisis, like I said, that our savings rate comes down. As the savings rate comes down, Niresh, more and more people will live this hand-to-mouth existence. Then you're not going to plan for the future. You're not going to try to buy a house or buy another plot of land, make an investment. You can't save for your child's education. You have to take a loan for that. Then everyone's lives become more precarious. So, and this is something that's not unique to Sri Lanka. It's happened all over the world, especially where there's debt distress. So the whole problem that again, I'm repeating what the NPP themselves said. They are the ones who said that this IMF program is going to leave us with more external debt, a debt to GDP of around 105%. And the IMF says that our debt will be sustainable. So the people have to understand that, yes, maybe things are stable. Maybe you're happy because the people you voted for have won. Maybe you think that, the friendly face that came with no security to your village and made a speech and was very, friendly with the whole village. Maybe you think it's good that that person is there representing you. But I think as time goes by and people see that their material conditions are not improving, and not only that, they're getting worse, which could very well happen, because now we are just ending this, we will just be ending this season, our tourism season, which is the high point of foreign exchange reserves in the country. So when the foreign exchange inflows dwindle, once again there'll be pressure on the rupee. When there's pressure on the rupee, we once again have upward pressure on inflation, right? And then we are starting vehicle imports again. And again, debt repayments are starting. This year, next year, we have to start paying the interest on our debt. All these things are going to come to a pass. And the NPP government could have used these 3 months to get ahead of these things. But maybe there are some negotiations happening in secret. Maybe they're not reported in the media, maybe they're not discussed in Parliament. But if all we have is what's being discussed in Parliament, it doesn't look like there is any kind of solution beyond this. Let's wait and see, let's struggle through for the next few years, and let's hope for the best. That I don't think will suffice.
Interesting thoughts indeed, Kusum. We need to take a short commercial break, folks, so don't go away. We'll be right back.
නව යෞවනියන් නව ජවයකින් ක්‍රිකට් පිටියේ නව යුගයක් සටහන් කිරීමට සූදානම්. ICC වයස අවුරුදු 19න් පහළ කාන්තා T20 ලෝක කුසලාන ක්‍රිකට් තරඟාවලිය 2025 රටවල් 16ක් සාඩම්බර කුසලානයක් අලංකාර තරඟාවලියක් ජනවාරි 18 වෙනිදා සිට TV1 සමග රැඳෙන්න.
Life's not about lines, it's about breaking free. It's not about boxes, it's about exploding beyond them. You're the miracle generation. Leading the way, rocking a magical vibe. Unleash your vibe. YFM Relax Party.
Welcome back to Face to Face. We are in conversation with Mr. Kusum Wijetilleke, who is a working committee member of the SJB. Now, Kusum, let's leave the present situation aside. For any country to compete, to go forward and become prosperous, that country needs to attract foreign investment, FDI. We in Sri Lanka have failed miserably at this for decades. I mean, we've hardly attracted any major players. But, and when I say major players, I mean Malaysia just about 6 months ago had investments in the billions of dollars from many of the major IT companies in the world, the giants, Apple and Meta and so on. We are not even in that league. We don't even seem to think of investment in those terms. But if we are to succeed as a nation, we need that type of investment. So how do we get there? Because right now we're growing at, I think the last quarter's result was something like 5.5%. But, you know, can that even be maintained? And how do we get up to 6.57, which is absolutely essential to bounce back from this economic debacle?
So, Niresh, I think most of the countries in our region that have been successful, that have successful economies, let's take the 4 East Asian tiger economies, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. How did these countries succeed? Sri Lankans will say, Sri Lanka is a small country, only 20 million people. Okay, Singapore has only 5 million people. How did they succeed?
I mean, we're not actually a small country. With 22,
far smaller countries than us.
Yeah. I mean, we're middle of the pack, certainly. Yeah. There are countries which have only 100,000, 200,000 people. And of course, You do get giants like India and China, but those are, just at the very top. After that, it just trails off. Between 100 million and about 10 million, there are a lot of countries. So we're not small by any means.
So these countries succeeded because they laid the foundations for foreign investment, because they understood that foreign investment is not just about the dollars and the money. It's about the expertise, the technology, the culture that's imported to the country. Those are the things that make a difference. In Singapore is a great example where they initially protected a few industries. Then they said, no more protection. You start competing with the people that come. Then those companies started building their own ecosystem around these multinationals that were investing hundreds of millions of dollars. Then those multinationals realized that some of these Singaporean companies, they can be useful to them. They can become part of their own supply chains. Then they start interacting. Then you get tech transfers, expertise transfers. Then they absorb local talent, train them, send them abroad for exposure. Then they come back to Singapore, form their own companies. This ecosystem has to start. Unfortunately, for example, our president went to India, to the Amul factory during the campaign. And he made the very explicit statement that he is not in favor of foreign investment, only technology investment. And I think this is something that their minds can be changed on. And I hope they can, because if we don't, that's going to be a big problem. We can't depend. There are no incentives in Sri Lanka for someone to come and invest their technology, right? Investors seek what? A profit motive. They're not here to do good for your economy, good for your rural economy. That's not their point. They are here to make a little extra money. You have to extract through incentives what is needed for your economy. So Sri Lanka has to, and its trade and investment is only one side. That policy is important. On the other side, you have to ensure that we no longer have institutional and elite capture of policy. This rent-seeking, protectionism that has, taken over large swaths of our economy, it cannot continue. Some of these conglomerates have been protected for decades. Some of our industries have been protected for decades, and they haven't moved up the value chain. The idea is that you protect an industry for 5 years, maybe 10 years at the most, so that they move up the value chain, so that the technology can advance themselves. Singapore, very clear. After a certain period, you don't get subsidies, you don't get incentives unless you're moving up the value chain, unless you're spending on research and development, unless you're hiring people and going into a different stream, they don't just give you incentives to expand. They give you incentives to innovate. That's the difference. There is no point us trying to develop more garment factories. You have to go into a new, higher technology form of export. This is what industrial policy is. The IMF themselves, in a report from 1995, Rachel Van Elkan, she talked about how Singapore and Hong Kong had what was called activist industrial policy, where they went and they selected sectors that they felt had the potential for growth. And today Singapore, because of those investments and decisions in the 80s, today Singapore is in aerospace technology, semiconductor manufacturing, precision machinery manufacturing, and people think Singapore is a service economy. Singapore has developed and diversified into more of a service economy than it was those days, but it still has a manufacturing sector that dwarfs most advanced countries. It is a manufacturing behemoth of the highest level of technology. That's where Sri Lanka could have been.
But Kusum, the Asian tigers that you mentioned, one common denominator in all of these, and with Malaysia, Thailand, and so on, is that they are eager for change. Those cultures, the people, they embrace change. Whereas we in Sri Lanka don't seem to want to change. Is this just decades of bad culture which is now haunting us?
I think it's an interesting question, Niresh. I think if what you say is true, if there's a cultural gap, then we can't fill that, right? But we can do other things. We can focus on education systems. We can focus on STEM. We can focus on training our people. And we can push. We can do the best we can. No one is saying we have to become a economies of scale manufacturing giant. But we have enough talented, for example, Sri Lanka, everyone knows, has talented engineers. We have an IT sector that is taking off with virtually very little state help, right? It's a good example of where the state has helped here and there a little bit. If I believe that if the state really wants to, it can really take off. The IT sector can really take off, but it's already taking off without that help, right? So in that same way, we have to make investments. So this is another thing, Niresh, that I expected differently from the NPP government. Just going back to that for a second. Center-left political thinking views government spending not as a cost, but as an investment, as something that the government has a productive role in the economy. One of those roles is investments in education, investments in training, right? Building human capital. These are the things that I expected the NPP to be at the forefront of, right? But we are still wondering how much can we spend on education, what's going to happen with the O-level papers. There's some controversy about the A-levels. I mean, this is not the root and branch transformation and if we don't do it now, we are right now, Niresh, you will know about this, we are in the midst of a technological revolution. We may be in the 5th industrial revolution, maybe the 4th is also over, who knows. We will get left behind once again. We got left behind during the height of the neoliberal era, where the industrialization of the Asian continent just bypassed Sri Lanka. All we have is the garment sector to show for it. And now the next technological revolution is also going to bypass us. So we have to start now.
I mean, Kusum, as far as technology goes, I think we are still stuck in the early 90s. There's very little difference when you look at Sri Lanka from what was then the D.R. Premadasa era to today. Very little has changed.
Yes, Niresh, I think it's very interesting how Lee Kuan Yew has such a, narrative that's built up based on what he said about Sri Lanka. Why is Lee Kuan Yew talking about Sri Lanka so much? It's because he noticed that Sri Lanka was on a certain path very early on. And then he saw Sri Lanka divert from that path. And he, clearly a keen observer of other nations, clearly someone who studied Sri Lanka's problems. And I think there were some things he said that may or may not have worked in Sri Lanka, but by and large, he saw where we went wrong, right? So Sri Lanka has this wealth of empirical evidence from our own region that we can study. We can look at policies that South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, we can look at the policies that they've done and we can learn from them.
But again, Kusum, the common denominator is that they ring in the changes. Singapore today is not what Singapore was 3 years ago. Yeah. They keep changing. Malaysia, if you visited Malaysia 10 years ago, you go back to Kuala Lumpur now, it's nothing like what it was. Yeah. Whereas Colombo is pretty much the same.
Well, we have the Shangri-La.
Just a few buildings, but
yeah,
I mean the experience, the ethos.
This is also an important point, Niresh. We said we want foreign investment. But do we need foreign investments to build another apartment complex in Sri Lanka? Do we need another mall in Colombo? This is not the type of foreign investment we need. We have to attract investments into tradable sectors, manufacturing capital, manufacturing finance. This is what we talked about, getting the top dogs in here, getting the major manufacturers to at least come and set up a R&D, at least get some engineering technology transfer, get some expertise transfers. We can get some exposure for our engineers. Sri Lanka has all these different ideas, but nothing is being implemented.
Now, Kusum, if you go back to President Chandrika, she wanted to make Colombo a banking hub and education hub, various hub ideas, but never invested and nothing happened. Then we had the Mahinda Chintane, which had, I think, again, a 6-hub strategy. Nothing happened. The government investment and strategy simply wasn't there for those sectors. So obviously they got nowhere. Whatever progress was made was due to a few smaller players in the private sector doing something. But again, when you look at our competitors, they invest, they forge ahead, they very clearly say, we are open for business in this particular industry. We, come to our country. But we don't do that.
No. There's a lot of excuses, like, we'll say culture, or we will say our market is too small, or we'll blame the war, or we blame Easter attacks, I just think that some Sri Lanka's greatest...
That's a lot of past, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, Easter attacks was
so going
a
forward
long
also
time back.
we'll say because of the economic crisis, or because of brain drain. So every country has challenges. That is what public policy is there to address. So my problem is that there is a certain, shall we say, the consensus, the median consensus in Sri Lanka's policy machinery is, let's make sure that we look after the investors. Let's try to support capital, okay? Because if you look after capital and you look after the employer, then everything else will trickle down to the economy. That hasn't worked. Now, the government in Sri Lanka is extremely inefficient. Everything as you said, everything they strategize, doesn't work out. But does that mean that we have to let a few conglomerates manage our national economy? Are they the ones who are going to set the economic development goals? I mean, let's get serious, right? You have to expect private enterprise is there for profit. The state is there to help them. But the state also has to work on development.
Yes,
now,
but do we as a nation, as a government, is there a dearth of strategists? I don't mean economists and, you've got university professors, you've got, accountants, you've got lawyers galore, engineers, but when it comes down to national strategy, and a national strategy has to have an objective. We are going to go from here to there, and why are we going to do it? To get this amount of investment in the face of competition from this country, and this country. We don't seem to think that way.
We don't seem to think that way, and I think if you watch the parliamentary debates, not just, I don't want to blame present parliament, but just think about previous parliaments. A parliamentary debate should be the cream of the debate, right? You're supposed to be pushing the boundaries. You're supposed to be talking about the details, the important things. That's not what's happening, even right now in our parliament. The debates in parliament are so superficial. They have absolutely no substance. They're usually mudslicking contests. So you have to expect that public policy will reflect the level of that debate. The level of that discourse is what's going to be reflected in our public policy. So as I said, let's wait for the NPP's budget. And let's hope that some part of their vision that they presented, and I will be very fair to the NPP, they did present a vision. They did have a criticism of the status quo. And it's in black and white in their manifesto, some part of it. So let's see what part of that manifesto is reflected in their budget. The point I wanted to make on this show is that the signs are not good. The signs are that this government is looking at incrementally tinkering around the edges of the Ranil Wickremesinghe austerity program, and then wrapping it up with a new withholding tax and a slightly higher tax threshold, and say, this is what we've done. It's going to be a rude awakening for them, because nobody likes to be betrayed. And if you came in on a certain platform and now you've completely abandoned it, there will be a price to pay. That's just the political reality.
As you said, it's early days in this government, and we have to wait and see for the budget, which is coming up. And I'm afraid, Kusum, that we are out of time. Thank you very much for being with us this evening. It's been a pleasure, as usual. And thank you very much to you at home for watching. Don't go away, because the news is coming up next. Have a good evening.
TV1. TV for life.
It's the 7th of January 2025. Our news team is hard at work to bring you the news at 9 p.m. tonight. And we've just got news that the President will be flying to China on an official visit. And to get more details about this story, let's talk to Nilakna Gunasekara. Nilakna, what are you working on?
Yes, Devin. So, Minister and Cabinet spokesperson Arinda Jayathis announced today that President Anurukumara Dissanayake will be leaving to China on the 14th of January. And in conjunction with this, several proposals were presented to the Cabinet yesterday and approval were received. So in conjunction with the President's visit, several proposals were presented to the Cabinet, including the continuous adherence to the One China policy, and the Cabinet also approved several agreements with the People's Republic of China. These include the Memorandum of Understanding between the Ministry of Health and Mass Media and the National Radio and Television Administration of the People's Republic of China, the Memorandum of Understanding between the Associated Newspapers Ceylon Limited and Xinhua News Agency of China, and many other memorandums and as well. So we will be bringing you a comprehensive report on this story and many other local stories and internationals on our bulletin tonight.
Thank you, Nilakna. And to get some details about the stories that's coming up on our international arena, let's talk to the producer of the day, Juad Abdin. Juad, what are you working on?
Yes, Steven, today's international news comes from Canada. Now, last night it was announced that the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had resigned from his position as the Prime Minister of the country. But he did say that he will continue to stay as the Liberal Party leader, and he will continue to stay in office rather, and as the Liberal Party leader until a new leader is selected. Now, the President of the Liberal Party has said that meeting with the Board of Directors will be happening this week, and following this meeting they will select the new leader, and we might see Canada select or elect a new Prime Minister following this meeting that will take place. Now, a comprehensive report on this, a proper explainer on what Trudeau has done throughout his tenure and why he resigned and who are the potential candidates that can replace him, will also be brought to you on our Primetime News Bulletin tonight.
Thank you, Juad. And as Juad said, to get a more comprehensive report on all of these stories and more, stay tuned to our Primetime News Bulletin at 9 p.m. on TV1.
TV1. TV for life.
President to visit China next week. Cabinet approves several agreements. Compensation for 17 victims harmed by substandard medicine. Suppliers to face legal action. Shooting in Dehivala. 2 dead. 3 exam papers leaked, disrupting grade 11 term exams in the North Central Province. Corruption behind rice deal. Government under scrutiny for million rupee transaction.